I've had worse. When I was in yeshiva in Israel, they have the world's cheapest instant coffee there, and it's really if you can drink, once you've drank that a few hundred times, you can drink literally any coffee. There's no coffee that is beyond. Anyway, good evening, gentlemen. We are studying Tanya's third chapter, the third chapter of Likutei Amarim Tanya. Inside the text, last time we learned, before Pesach, we were discussing it's actually, I've literally just thought about this. I should have thought it when I was preparing the class, but I literally just thought that it's really divine providence that we're studying this now, because we talk about the 10 Sefiros every day, right, when we're counting the Omer. And in fact, or at least the 7 Sefiros, we talk about 7 of the 10 Sefiros every day. And in fact, this is the topic of our current chapter. Chapter 3 of Tanya, as we discussed last time, we are beginning to go into the structure and function of the godly soul, right? Chapter 1 of Tanya is about the animal soul, the nefesh habahamis, the nefesh tivis. Chapter 2 is about the godly soul of the Jew, which is literally a piece of God above. Chapter 3, we begin to discuss the structure of the godly soul. Chapter 4 and 5, in descending order, going outward, we will continue to talk about the godly soul, what it is and what it does, etc. What it is, how it's built, and what it does, kind of. Then, in chapter 6, God willing, we begin to talk about the same thing with the Nefesh HaBahamis. And that's chapter 6, 7, and 8, if I recall correctly. And then starting chapter 9, we begin to discuss their interactions. That's the structure of the chapters of the Tanya, if you were looking at the map. So we begin to discuss the 10 faculties of the godly soul, the 10 koiches pnimiyim, as they're called, the 10 inner faculties of the godly soul. And we discussed last time that these 10 faculties are not what the godly soul is. What the godly soul is a piece of God above, right? Which means no structure, no form, no shape, because of course God Himself, right, is the same thing. What the soul is a piece of God at its essence, at its deepest self, its mahus, its very being. What it is, who it is a piece of God. However, just as in godliness above, God does not relate to the world simply, but rather through finite form, limited and finite and defined form and structure, just as God emanates something called the 10 Sefirot, so too the soul, which is derived from that godliness, the soul also comes with a 10 Sefirot or a 10 faculty structure that it uses to relate to God, right? Because when we're talking about the godly soul, this must be remembered. If we forget all the details, we have to remember this above and beyond everything that we're going to discuss in this chapter. Where the godly soul is only interested in God, right? In other words, all the faculties of the godly soul are discussed in terms of how they relate to Hashem. It's important to remember this. There's a few reasons why it's important to remember this. One of the reasons is that since this is the first time we're going to be meeting all of these structures and all of these things, and we're only going to be talking about them in a godly context, a person could think that the Tanya is speaking about a person that's not like us, when in actuality, the Tanya is speaking only about the godly soul. The reason why the Tanya says that Chesed is about Avas Hashem, for example, love of God, whereas to us, Chesed can mean Avas pizza, right? Or something else like that, is not because the Alter Rebbe has overlooked people with our loves. It's because we are discussing only the godly soul, right? We're not discussing our regular day-to-day vitality, the animal soul, and all the things that it would love. We're discussing the godly soul, and the godly soul in all of its faculties, with all of its being, who it is a piece of God, and therefore everything that it does and all its modes of expression and all the structure, all of its shape, is all God-centric. It is only interested in godliness. It has no connection to, interest in, or understanding of anything else other than godliness. So the Alter Rebbe, the third chapter is basically an enumeration of and a description of the 10 faculties of the soul. Although the truth is that the Alter Rebbe really only focuses on 5. This chapter explains what Chachma, Bina, and Das are, and it also explains what Chesed and Gvura are, which is 5 of the 10 Sefiros. The other 6, because he also describes Tiferes. He describes 6 of the 10 spheres. The other 4, which are Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, are left implicit without explaining what they are. And there's a reason for that, which I hope we'll get to maybe a little bit more today. That'll be a little bit more explained. So the goal of today's class is that before we go in and do this textually and thoroughly with all of the Alter Rebbe's definitions and really get into the 10 faculties of the godly soul in a very zoomed in way, with in the style of our class, where everything is zoomed in and very slow, I thought I would give a preface in which we discuss the concept of the 10 spheres and the 10 kochos, right? The 10 divine manifestations, 10 divine traits, and the 10 faculties of the soul, and we would discuss them, what they are, and in connection to each other in a more broad fashion, so that when we get all zoomed in, the goal is we won't get lost. We won't lose the forest for the trees, as we say in English. I don't know what you say in Hebrew, but we won't. Yeah, same concept, exactly. So we're not going to get bogged down in the details, in the weeds, as they say, and lose picture of the broader thing. So, without further ado, I would like to discuss the 10 spheres. So this is going to be a very Kabbalah-orientated class, which is why it's a pity that Ronnie's not here. I don't know where he is. The 10 spheres, the 10 divine traits, are a description of godliness in relation. Right? In other words, God himself is 1, not 10. In fact, God himself is beyond 1. Oh, that was fine, but thank you.
Are you sure?
Yeah. Both, either or, whatever you want.
This is tea.
Oh, just very kind. Thank you. Very kind of you. Thank you. I was happy with either. The God is 1. I'm not making any dramatic statements here, but the truth is that God is beyond being 1. God is 1 is the lowest way of putting it. Really, God is beyond 1. God is totally alone, right? God is totally singular. 1 means there's room for 2. God is 1 in a way, but there's no room for 2. That's why you say God is alone. God is singular. God transcends the concept of being enumerable, is the way you would put it in English. In other words, he's beyond, even though there is only 1, the concept or the ability to actually count things actually comes after God. It doesn't reach God, for the simple reason that quantity implies division. Right, implies the ability to count, implies that there's a difference between 1 and 2, or 1 and 1.2, right, or however you want to look at it, right? This itself describes difference. It's itself a concept that in its own way, in a very abstract and virtual way, and this is a lot of what, for those who know, this is a lot about what scientists speculate about nowadays, and theoretical scientists and all these things, about that numbers themselves are connected to space and time and the universe, right? God in his essence, God as he is unto himself, so to speak, God just as God, is beyond all of these things. God is absolutely alone. He's 1 and there is no second. He is totally beyond the entire concept. So when we say that there are something called the 10 divine sfirot, there's 10 things and they're godly, right? They're 10 things and they're elokus, they're godliness, they're, as we say in Yiddish, they're getlichkeit, godliness. What we are describing cannot be God himself. This is the first thing you have to know. We are describing God as he has decided to relate to something. God as he has left himself, so to speak, to relate to something outside of himself. The 10 Sefiros, for this reason and for other reasons, which maybe we'll have occasion to go into more in chapter 4 of Tanya, the 10 Sefiros are called often levushim, garments, or more precisely within garments, they're called takshitim. They are called adornments, jewelry for God. Because adornments and garments are tools, are objects of relation, right? It's something that you have in order to conceal and reveal yourself in a public settings to others, right? It's all other orientated. That's one of the very basic reasons why they're called this. In fact, this is what the Alter Rebbe says it means when you say, when you read on Erev Shabbos. The whole thing we read on Erev Shabbos is all about the 10 Sefiros, by the way. So a lot of what I'm going to say, you may even know already just from reading the Pasuk Eliyahu, which we read on Erev Shabbos. The Asara Tikkunin that it talks about there, which literally translated means the 10 reparations, as the Sefiros are called, the Alter Rebbe teaches Tikkun based on the Targum Onkelos. He translates the word Tikkun as jewelry. That's actually the way the Alter Rebbe, which is based on an Onkelos, when Onkelos, on the verse that says a man's not supposed to wear the garments of a woman, Lo Silbash, the Targum Onkelos says, he translates it as, I think, tikuna itza, or something like that. Tikuna itta, the garment of a woman. Tikkun is a garment. Anyway. So that's why they're sometimes called garments, because the Sefiros are God in relation. This is very important to remember. In general, taking even a further step back, even more general from the Sefiros. In general, when we learn the one of the reasons that we are allowed to learn Kabbalah in this generation, and in fact, it's a mitzvah for everyone to learn Pnimius HaTorah, as the Alter Rebbe outlines in Hilchos Talmud Torah. You can go read the Alter Rebbe's Laws of Torah study. You may get a bit of a shock if you do so. It's a big responsibility. The halachic obligations outlined there, so not for the faint of heart. But if you go and study it, you will see that that learning Pnimius HaTorah is a fundamental part of Limud HaTorah, halachically speaking. That everyone is supposed to learn Pnimius HaTorah, the inner aspects of the Torah. But of course, we know that this was not always the case. We know that there was a time when the inner aspect of the Torah was a secret, or was a private knowledge held among only the certain elite students of the Torah. Right, it was a tradition, master to student, stretching to time immemorial. Right, the classic example before you get into even the question of the Zohar, or because the Zohar was revealed later, before you even get into the question of, before you get into the Talmudic aspects of Kabbalah, the mentions of Kabbalah and expressions of Kabbalah in the Talmud, and before you get into even the later revelations that were in Tzfas, with the Ramak and the Arizal and different things like that, the classic example is the Ramban, right? Nachmanides, the Ramban, was famously known as a Kabbalist. His whole commentary on the Torah is based on Kabbalah, and his tradition of Kabbalah was totally master to student, not based on any of the texts, any of the modern texts of Kabbalah. In other words, what the Ramban knew, he knew because his teacher knew it, who knew it because his teacher knew it, and so far back indefinitely. There are only a very, very few ancient books of the Kabbalah that actually existed as books. One of them is the Sefer HaBahir, very famous, which is translated, I think, as the book of, it also means illumination, similar to Zohar. The Sefer HaBahir, traditionally said to be written by or compiled by, I believe, Nechunya ben Hakama, if I remember correctly. Was it Pinchas ben Yair? Oh, now I'm confusing myself. One of the sages of the Talmud, and then you have, of course, Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah is the most ancient. Parts are attributed to Avram Avinu. Others say from Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, of course, as all Kabbalists know, was himself a great Kabbalist. As it says, he was the one who was able to enter the Pardes and leave the Pardes in peace, right? Reflecting his tremendous mystical abilities. And frankly, if Rabbi Akiva did not know it, it would be very unlikely for us to have it today, because at some point, basically all of Judaism came through Rabbi Akiva and his students. So it stands to reason anyway that he would have been a great Kabbalist. But anyway, made myself totally off track. Once upon a time, all the study of Kabbalah was a great secret, and these works that were published were not works that were really like. If you read the Sefer Yetzirah is very, very short in its. If you just read the text, it's very short and almost impossible to understand. You read it and you say, "What did I just read?" There was nothing there. It's so hidden that you read it and it's like it's insubstantial. It doesn't even seem like something significant. It didn't really say anything. Yeah, exactly. It's very short, and you read it and you say, "Did I even read anything? Like, did I even just read? Like, what was this? Right? It all just goes in and goes out. There's no like. It's not even the Baal Shem Tov says that the phrase cheshach kafel u'mekufel, right, the double and redoubled darkness, means a darkness so deep that you don't even know it's dark, right? It's a similar thing with a secret, right? There's some secrets where it's a secret, but there's a big red flag that says it's a secret, and there's other secrets which are so secret that it's right out in the open. It doesn't hurt anything because it's so hidden that you don't even know there's a secret there, right? So that's like what these svarim are kind of like. Yes, thank you very much. Who was a student of or a friend of Pinchas ben Yair, I believe. But anyway, Pinchas ben Yair is the one who said the famous brisa that the Mesilas Yesharim is based on. All the traits that lead to godliness. But I don't know if that's related or unrelated. In later generations, the Arizal, one of the greatest Kabbalists to ever live, perhaps the greatest, aside from ancient figures, certainly the greatest Kabbalist since the ancient times, was the Arizal, Rav Yitzchak Luria. And he said that it's a mitzvah to reveal Kabbalah to everyone. And there's multiple reasons why. One of the reasons why it's safe to learn Kabbalah now is because there was an ancient concern about the idea of the Sefiros, right? You can generally divide Kabbalah into two tendencies or two halves, very generally. There's one aspect of Kabbalah which discusses God's utter transcendence, right? Something called the Or Ein Sof, or the Ein Sof, right? The infinitude of God. This aspect of Kabbalah is much more in line at a simple level. Finally, this aspect of Kabbalah is much more in line at a simple level with the teachings, traditional Jewish teachings about God, which talk about God as infinite and being beyond limitation. Whereas the other side of Kabbalah talks all about finite things, about form, about Sefiros and Partsufim, about limited and defined expressions or manifestations of godliness. This aspect of Kabbalah was considered traditionally to be much more dangerous, for the simple reason that it talks about God in a way that if a person doesn't know what they're talking about, makes God and godliness sound like things that are very, very familiar, right? Rather than things that are totally beyond. It talks about God in an immanent way, not just in a transcendent way. So in other words, once it starts talking about God's wisdom and God's kindness as actual realities, which are defined as wisdom and kindness, then immediately the human desire is to 100% understand these things and then manipulate them and use them for our own human ends. And of course, this is extremely dangerous because that is basically what idolatry is. Idolatry is there is something which comes from God, which has its own power that I can use for my own benefit. That's what idolatry is, fundamentally, right? As opposed to everything being reliant on God. And so, without the ability, lahafshit hadvarim magash miyusam, without the ability to abstract the Kabbalah away from its physical words and the physical way of understanding them, the Kabbalah can be a grossly misunderstood and misconstrued thing, and that is in fact what happened many times and to many people in many infamous incidents in Jewish history. The Kabbalah, unfortunately, has been used in that way. It's a terrible effect. And I am sure that the real Kabbalists at the time deeply wished that the whole thing had remained a true secret. However, nowadays, aside from the fact that most of us have no spiritual inclination to worship even idols, first of all, and second of all, we're too stupid to really understand what Kabbalah says anyway, and third of all, we're given the tools and we are given the explanations of Kabbalah and the opening up of Kabbalah with many metaphors and parables so that the regular human intellect can appreciate at least a little bit what the Kabbalah is talking about in an abstract way. It has become much less dangerous to study Kabbalah, and certainly within the context of Chassidus, because Chassidus does not just study concepts in Kabbalah, right? Just studying concepts in the eyes of Chassidus is not really a very Jewish thing, in the sense of I am learning things to build my own knowledge, right? I don't know, as we're going to learn in the chapter 5 of Tanya, that is not really the idea. That's not the idea of Torah study. That's not the idea of Limud HaTorah, certainly not the idea of Limud HaKabbalah. The purpose of Limud HaTorah, and certainly of Limud Pnimiyus HaTorah, learning the inner aspect of the Torah, is to connect to God, right? And to accomplish what God wants accomplished through these things. And the entire danger of the Kabbalah is greatly mitigated and greatly lessened. It's made much less dangerous if it is approached in a context of the worship of God in a holy way, and in the context of of an approach which correctly contextualizes Kabbalah. This is why it was the opinion of many Hasidic masters that the commonly held belief that Chassidus is a commentary on Kabbalah is completely incorrect. It's completely misfounded. Chassidus does not exist as a commentary on Kabbalah. Chassidus is something else that uses Kabbalah to explain what Chassidus wants to explain. But all of the details of that is for later. The only reason I'm bringing that up now is to point out that if you have a certain goal that's already established that you're using Kabbalah for, it's much less dangerous than and much less likely to go astray and turn into something strange than if the person says, let me become a great genius of Kabbalah. That's a terrible way to start with learning Kabbalah, right? As the Talmud says, why was Rabbi Akiva able to leave in peace? Because he entered in peace. In other words, he entered for a certain purpose, which was peace, and that's why he was able to leave peacefully. People who just go wandering into the orchard for fun, or profit, or pleasure, or whatever other reason, much less likely to leave in peace.
So what's the relation between Chassidus and Kabbalah? Is Kabbalah the source of Chassidus or no?
No, what I was just saying is that Chassidus is not a commentary on Kabbalah. So it's not the source of Chassidus in the sense of like the way the Mishnah is the source of the Gemara, for example. That is not the case. Chassidus is not a commentary on Kabbalah. The source of Chassidus is from a similar source as Kabbalah, in the sense of it comes from holy neshamas who are able to perceive the inner realities of the Torah, such as the Baal Shem Tov for Chassidus and the Arizal for Kabbalah. However, Chassidus is not just Kabbalah. Long story short, it's a longer discussion for a different time. The Rebbe has a very famous kuntras, a very famous talk that he gave, which was made into a pamphlet called Kuntras in Yana Shel Torah Chassidus, which describes what is Chassidus in the Rebbe's understanding, and that is a very detailed and thorough explanation of that concept, although it may leave you wanting just to learn it. You may not get the full meal that you're looking for there. It requires some explanation. The bottom line is that the way I would put it, it's too controversial. We'll discuss that at a different time, God willing. Okay, the point of that whole rant is that Kabbalah is to be taken when we talk about the Sefiros especially. We have to realize we don't know what we're talking about, right? Kabbalah is non-literal. We discussed this a little bit last time as well. When we talk about God's wisdom, it has not almost, with a very, very, very slight exception, it has almost nothing to do with what we call wisdom, right? So too chesed, right? So to God's kindness. And even though we're going to, in the Tanya, speak about what these things are in the neshama, and we're going to say that they are this way because they derive from the divine reality. In other words, the neshama's chachma, which is much, the soul's wisdom, which is much more like what we would normally consider wisdom, right, comes from Hashem's wisdom. You have to understand that the sense in which it comes from it is in a very distant sense. You have to abstract things from their physicality. You have to understand that we're not talking, that to talk about these things in this naive, literal fashion is to make a terrible, terrible mistake. I told you the story previously, right, about the Rogachover and the Or Sameach. Does this ring a bell? I told the story, but anybody else here? The Rogachover and the Or Sameach. I think I've said this before in this class. We'll say it again. So the next time when I ask, you'll remember. So you're saying don't get ahead of myself. It may take a few more than that. There was once a town. There is still a town. Pardon me, called Dvinsk in Latvia. The town of Dvinsk, at some point in the first half of the 20th century, the early 1900s, had two rabbis, as many towns in Eastern Europe did. It had a Hasidic rabbi and a non-Hasidic rabbi, because it had two communities, a Hasidic community and a non-Hasidic community, which lived very peacefully and with a lot of mutual respect, by the way, and among the rabbis as well. And the two rabbis were two great rabbis who became very, very well known and world famous. One was known as the Rogachover Gaon, the Gaon of Rogachov, with whom our Rebbe had a correspondence. And if you read in Rabbi Steinsaltz's biography of the Rebbe, in the back, if you turn to the appendices, he talks about how the Rebbe's Derech HaLimud in Torah, the whole way the Rebbe learns Torah, is in a way an extension of and building on the way that the Rogachover learned Torah. The Rogachover the truth is that I'm not smart enough to know for a fact how much of a genius he is, but the fact is, the Rogachover is an astounding genius. You had another rabbi of the town who was also a genius, whose name was the Or Sameach, the yeshiva named after him you may have heard of, right? At least I think it's named after him. He was the non-Hasidic Rav of the town. The Or Sameach was very friendly, very personable, and he was very tall. So even some of the Chassidim would go to him because he was much more friendly. The Rogachover was much more irascible and short with people. I heard a story once, something along the lines of, I don't know if the story is true, someone asked the Rogachover a question and he sent them back like 19 citations to the Gemara, and every citation that he sent them was every page of the Gemara where the word chamor appears, where the word donkey appears. So I heard such a story. So that gives you a sense of the Rogachover. So the Rogachover used to be very kind and welcoming. Usually, what? That's absolutely no question at all. The Rogachover Gaon was always he generally didn't have a lot of patience for yeshiva students, but he always had patience for the students of Tomchei Tzimim. He was a Chabad Chassid, but I believe not from Lubavitch, from one of the other sons of the Tzemach Tzedek. But he was always very welcoming to students of Tomchei Tzimim. He said, not because they know anything, but because they know they don't know. That was what he said. As opposed to students from other yeshivas who thought that they knew. Anyway, so the Rogachover Gaon was very short and very irascible. So one day after Shacharis in Dvinsk, they're eating herring and drinking schnapps, of course, what you do after Shacharis, right? And they're having a debate. A debate breaks out in the synagogue. The debate is over who's bigger, the Rogachover or the Or Sameach. Right? And they're debating, this one says, this one's greater, this one says, that one's greater. The story goes that a small child, a little boy, walks up and he hears them debating who's bigger, and he starts laughing. And they say, little boy, why are you laughing? He says, everyone in the whole town knows, anyone who's walked on the streets of Dvinsk knows, that the Or Sameach is much bigger. Right? It's the Or Sameach. Go take a measuring tape. Are you blind? You need new glasses? The Or Sameach is much bigger than the Rogachover. And he's laughing and laughing at them. And they tell him, Yingle, young boy, you have no idea what we're talking about. We are not talking about, if you took a measuring tape, who's bigger. We're talking about like who's greater, who has greater learning, who's a greater genius, who's holier. That's what we're discussing. And the boy told them, and it only really works in Yiddish, but the boy tells them, ach pshetlach, right? Which means like you're giving cute interpretations now. Like, I know what you really said, right? You really said who's bigger. Don't come to me now with your like complicated, you're trying to defend yourself, that you're confused over who's bigger. I know what you meant the first time when you said who's bigger, right? What's the point of the story? The story was told to me in yeshiva. What's the point of the story? The point of the story is that a lot of the times we're like the child, where we read the word and we connect the word to a meaning, and we decide that anyone else who's trying to explain this meaning in a more subtle, right, or a more abstract way, they must be trying to pull the wool over our eyes, because I really know what the word really means, right? The point of the story is don't be a child. That's the point of the story. The point of the story is in Chassidus, when we talk about these inyanim, right, we only have what our teachers teach us. We don't have, the words are of no help. The names, when you call it Chachma of Atzilus, because the Sefira is called Chachma, that tells you nothing. You don't know anything about Chachma, but just because I've given it a name now and called it wisdom, don't think that you actually know anything about it. The only thing we can know about it, we know from what we are taught by people who actually know, right? And when they teach it, they inevitably say that it has nothing to do with wisdom, as we understand the word simply down here. Okay, that's the non-literality of the Sefiros. Continuing on. What's the point of having 10 Sefiros? The 10 Sefiros are these 10 expressions of God, these 10 forms of godliness, are often described as the means by which God creates, right? You could even say tools, although this would be a very bad metaphor. It's a metaphor. You could say the tools with which God creates, but this would be like one of the worst metaphors you can have for spirits. There's much more refined ones, because tools automatically imply that they're not part of God. It's a whole mess when you say tools. But you could say, but building on the previous point, for the amount that any physical metaphor is correct, right? So you could say, just for the 1% of correct that using the word tools is, you could say even that it's the tools with which God creates, right? The question is why would God need tools to create, right? In other words, why doesn't God just create everything by snapping his fingers, kavyachol, so to speak, right? By magic, we would say in English. Why doesn't God create everything by magic? First, there's nothing. Then there's something. And in fact, didn't I hear once, that God does create yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing, in this sense, right? The answer is, and really this is foundations of Kabbalah, right? When I said Kabbalah has two aspects, where it talks about God's infinitude and then the finite manifestations of God. So the basic principle is that both of these things go into the creation of the world. You have the infinitude, the transcendence of God. What we're going to see soon is called Sevev Kol Almin, the light of God which surrounds all worlds. Words that themselves need to be explained and not taken literally, by the way. Then you have, opposite that, you have Mamale Kol Almin. You have godliness that fills all worlds. And both of these directions, both of these tendencies, the Kabbalah teaches us, are used in the creation of the world. In other words, God, in creating the world, creates it both with his transcendence, his being beyond the world, his infinitude, and his immanence, his finitude, the godliness within all things. The point of there being 10 Sefiros is in order that there can be godliness within all things. That's the answer. The reason why God doesn't just snap his fingers is because everything that God snaps his fingers to create exists as something that has only the relationship with God that he snapped his fingers to create it. That's the whole relationship that it has with God. Other than that, no connection. Whereas, when something, like everything in our universe, is created through the 10 Sefiros, through the immanence of God, that means that godliness is within it in some profound sense. Godliness is close. Godliness is present, right? And God very much wanted to create a world where godliness is close. So in a sense, you could even say, and I have heard it said in a Chassidus class before, you could say that the reason God used the 10 Sefiros is in order that we can have this class right now and learn about the 10 Sefiros. Because if God created by no means, there would be nothing to study. Yeah? And if there was nothing to study, then our soul's capacity to know God through seichel, something that we will learn about in this chapter and again in chapter 5, would be severely limited. There would be very little for the soul to connect to God with in this way, where godliness could become the inner reality of the soul, which is what intellect is. So in order, it's paradoxical, right? But in this beautiful, traditionally Kabbalistic way, in order that the soul of a Jew should be able to appreciate godliness, God created the world and the soul of the Jew through a process which can be understood, if you follow what I just said. In other words, the process exists in order that there should be a process, is one of the profound answers to this question, because if there was no process, then beings who are created through process would not be able to understand it, right? And yes, it is circular and doesn't really make sense in rationality, which brings me to my next point, which is that the 10 Sefiros are God's means for creation, a means for creating the world. They exist in order that God can be within things, right? In the sense that He is in things with the Sefiros. I don't want to overcomplicate things, but you should just note that the Ur HaSevev, the infinitude of God, is also within everything, but in a different way. It's within everything, but in a different way. There's different ways of being within something, right? But in order that God could be within something by being close to it, being within it on its terms, you would say, right? Therefore, there's 10 Sefiros. We only know the 10 Sefiros because of revelation. This is the next point. We only know the 10 Sefiros because the Torah teaches us about the 10 Sefiros, right? Pnimius HaTorah. The truth is that many of the Sefiros are found in Psukim, right? L'cha Hashem HaGedula v'Hagevura v'Hanetzach v'Hahod, right, for example, and many other places as well. However, what that means, what they are, that these are Sefiros, what are Sefiros, and all of that, it all comes from Kabbalah. There is no way, even though we're going to explain the 10 Sefiros rationally, in the sense of we're going to explain what they correlate to in the soul in such a way that the soul's faculties, which correspond to the Sefiros, will be rationally understood. Nevertheless, the Sefiros themselves cannot be derived in the opposite direction. In other words, if a human being had no Torah and just sat with the world trying to find the 10 Sefiros, they would not be able to find the 10 Sefiros in principle. This is what we're taught anyway, right? Rationally speaking, and no philosophers in philosophy ever discovered the 10 Sefiros. There's no such concept, right? The 10 Sefiros are a concept known in Revelation. The 10 Sefiros are something that we only know as a Kabbalah. Kabbalah literally means received wisdom, right? We only know it because we were taught it. And they cannot be rationally derived, which one of the important reasons to know this is because sometimes, and this really goes back to the previous mistake with the Rogachover and the Ursamech we were talking about, sometimes we feel so familiar that we start trying to derive in the opposite direction, right? Where we start saying, well, in my experience, there's something in between Chachma and Bina, so there must be something in Kabbalah like that too. This is a one-way, this is like a trap door. It only opens one way. There's no working backwards to the principles of the Sefiros. In principle, there's no way to derive them from the world.
So how did Abraham relate to this? Did he agree?
No, through knowledge of God. Abraham was a prophet.
Through prophecy.
Yeah, Abraham spoke to God in the Torah many times. Absolutely.
But did it get passed on that way?
Yes, it did, but I think there are other prophets as well. So there's multiple sources, there's multiple prophets. And fundamentally, Kabbalah traces back to, there's only two modes in Kabbalah and in Chassidus as well, really. There's only two modes in Pnimius HaTorah, in the inner aspect of the Torah. Either you are a prophet and God is telling you what the Kabbalah says, like Abraham, Yeshayahu Hanavi, Shimon Bar Yochai, the Arizal, or the Baal Shem Tov, for example. Or you are a student who agrees to only receive from your teacher, but not to innovate your own things. Those are the only two modes. Those are the only two choices in Pnimius HaTorah. Unlike in the revealed aspect of the Torah, where knowledge is acquired in all the ways that it is that regular secular knowledge is acquired, where a person can use their logic and deductive reason, and the person can bring new ideas and new concepts and fight it out, right, to some extent, right, and innovations and all of these things. In Pnimius HaTorah, there's only two modes. It's Kabbalah. It's all receiving, right? That's one of the reasons it's called received wisdom, rather than innovating or creating or teaching, right? Okay, let's get into the 10 Sefiros. We will start with we'll start with some things that the 10 Sefiros correspond to before we get to this drawing. The 10 Sefiros, almost in Kabbalah, almost everything that is enumerated is connected to the 10 Sefiros. In other words, almost anything that comes in any number of forms is derived from the Kabbalah, and there is some Kabbalah sefer that explains it. In other words, all multiplicity, right? If you have multiple colors, then they all come from the Sefiros. If you have multiple personality types, they all come from the Sefiros. If you have multiple periods in history, they all come from the Sefiros. All in general, multiplicity and division, and there's a reason why this is so in the Kabbalah, because when God creates the world, all multiplicity and division traces back to the 10 Sefiros, right? All things that are diverse, enumerated, different, right? All derive from the 10 Sefiros in various combinations. So, lots of things correspond to the 10 Sefiros. I want to touch on just a few of the most famous. And everything that we're going to say now, till the end of the class, should be taken in the sense of a very, very, very brief crash course in these matters. Everything we're going to be talked about has like a billion books written about it. So just keep that in mind. The first thing the 10 Sefiros correspond to is the four-letter name of God, right? The four-letter name of God is somewhat mysterious, the Yud, and then the Hey, and then the Vav, and then the Hey. This is the name of God as we learned when we learned Shar Yichud Ve'emunah all the way back in chapter 1, it was a very long time ago, of the second part of Tanya. We learned that the four-letter name of God means constantly creating. That's really what it means, grammatically conjugated. It's it's heva, which means is or isifying, bringing into being, and the yud means constantly. The yud before it, so it means God constantly bringing into being. The four-letter name of God also describes the means by which God constantly brings into being. The yud corresponds to chachma, the point of chachma. The first Hey expands upon the Yud, the way like the Hey is built like a house, right? It's a Yud, but it blown up or expanded. That's Bina. Then you have the Vav, which is Zah, the 6 emotive attributes, which is the Vav, because the Vav is a line drawn down. Zah's function is to draw the Seichel and draw the intellect down into lower realities. And then you have the final Hey, which is Malchus, the last of the 10 Sefiros, which is kingship and majesty, which is the final external expression. So the structure of God's four-letter name is in the 4 letters, it corresponds to the 10 Sefiros. Furthermore, the structure of the human body, as you know if you read Pasach Eliyahu and Erev Shabbos in the Siddur, the structure of the body corresponds to the 10 Sefiros. There's many different ways that this can be described, but when you read there what the structure is, you have Chachma is the brain, Bina is the heart, Chesed and Gvura, the right arm and the left arm, right? Tiferes is the torso, Netzach and Hod is the right and the left leg, Yesod is the bris, is the circumcision, and Malchus is the mouth. There are other configurations of the 10 spheres, which correspond to different body parts, by the way. In general, this is another parenthetical remark that may be useful to you. In general, in Chassidus, when we talk about Kabbalah, there is a very specific Kabbalistic tradition that Chassidus uses, right? Which is not to invalidate any other Kabbalistic tradition. The point is that Chassidus is very focused on a certain set of teachings that the Baal Shem Tov received from his teachers, all the way, a tradition from the Arizal. Of what Kabbalah is and how Kabbalah works. Baal Shem Tov's teacher was Adam Baal Shem. There were other Baal Shems, as you can read in the previous Rebbe's writings, and they all went back to going back to the students of the Arizal, and the Baal Shem Tov had his own tradition of which text and which learning from the Arizal is the, so to speak, what I don't know what you would call it, the core curriculum of Kabbalah. Kabbalah, there's many, many, many more Sfarim in Kabbalah, like uncountably more books than there are that are cited in Chassidus. So everything you have to realize is much, much more complicated, even than Chassidus describes, which sometimes is astonishing because Chassidus can be very complicated. So that's the body, right? Now I'd like you to look at this piece of paper that I've got for you. I'll hold it up for the camera, although it may reverse it. Sure. We have one of these. You may have seen one of these before. A picture like this. This is a scan from a book from the translation, from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's translation of Sefer Yetzirah, which if you ever want some cool, weird-looking Kabbalistic drawings, you can appreciate the drawings without even reading the book. You can just buy the book and you can read it, look at all the pretty pictures. There he has the list of the Sefiros. Now these are 10 Sefiros. You'll notice immediately, Kil noticed immediately that Das is not here. Instead, Keser is here. Keser here in this order is the first of the Sefiros, which is a tradition from the Arizal of counting them in those 10 ways. I believe this is the Arizal's description of I'll describe to you what this is, what's going on here in a minute. So those are the two general ways of counting the 10 Sefiros. You can either count Keser or you can count Das. More commonly in Chassidus, we count Das. Although Keser is described at immense length in Chassidus, but it's not normally enumerated. More commonly among the 10 Sefiros when you're enumerating them. Practically speaking, since we hold that Keser exists as well, whether it is one of the 10 Sefiros becomes more of a precise and particular question, right? You would have to ask the question, what does it mean to be one of the 10? Because everyone agrees that all 11 things exist. The only question is, what are the 10 Sefiros, right? So that becomes a much more particular question. Very similar, and actually what it reminds me of actually is the question of which mitzvahs are the 613, right? Even though everyone agrees on everything the Torah tells you to do, the whole disagreement is, but which one of the things the Torah tells you to do are the 613? And that becomes a very involved question involving great genius, but for the practical and simple people, it doesn't necessarily change so much. I'm not knowledgeable enough to say the same about this question, but that's what it reminds me of. Yeah. 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. I understand. No, and Chassidus quotes that all the time. It's just a disagreement of what the 10 are, right? And why that's significant, right? Which is beyond the scope of our class. I'm just explaining to you why Das isn't on this picture. So, trying to decide what to talk about first. Let's start like this. One of the reasons I took a picture from Sefer Yetzirah for this class and not from somewhere else is because in our chapter, and we've read this already, but next time, God willing, we'll go back and read inside, and we'll show you this inside. The Alter Rebbe is citing Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah is the oldest source that talks about the 10 Sefiros, first of all. The Alter Rebbe cites Sefer Yetzirah when he talks about the 10 Sefiros here. He quotes from Sefer Yetzirah. And what he quotes is this picture. So that's why I brought this from Sefer Yetzirah, the picture for you. Sefer Yetzirah in the original does not have pictures. I have to clarify, everything has to be clarified, right? The book itself does not have pictures. The book itself is very short and it's just words, right? The experiment of Aryeh Kaplan did the translation, they expanded and did the picture so you can really visualize what it's discussing. Okay. I'm disclaimed. So the Alter Rebbe says that the 10 Sefiros are the three mothers and the 7 pairs. Okay, 7 kfulas, 7 doubles or pairs, not like the fruit. Pairs as in doubles, right? So the 3 mothers and the 7 doubles, which is a quote from Sefer Yetzirah. Those are the 10 Sefiros, okay? What it says in Sefer Yetzirah is like this. Don't ask too many questions because you'll find out how little I know about it, okay? It's all connected. Sefer Yetzirah is all about numbers and letters. That's really what the whole book's about. It's about numbers, in math, like math numbers, and the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. That's really the overt topic. That's what the whole discussion is there, right? So the letters correspond to Sefiros, right? The 3 mothers are the 3 intellectual faculties known as Chabad, Chachma, Bina, and Das, right? The 3 intellectual faculties correspond to 3 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and you can see them. They're the horizontal lines here, right? They are Shin, Ayin, and Mem. Those are the 3 mothers in Sefer Yetzirah. Shin, Aleph, Mem. What did I say? Oh, pardon me. Shin, Aleph, and Mem. Then you have the 7. One second here. Write this down to make it easier. You have the 7 doubles. The 7 doubles are the letters. So the 7 doubles at the simple level, when you talk about the 7 pairs or the 7 couples, when you're talking about the Hebrew alphabet, are the 7 letters that can be written either with a dot or without a dot. Apparently, I'm only telling you what I read. I don't know anything about this. Those letters are Beis, Gimel, Dalid, Chaf, Pei, Reish, and Tav, right? Which is 7 letters. Beged Kaparas, or Kaparta. Beged Kaparat. Those are the 7 letters which can be written double, either with an emphasis, with a dot, with a dagesh for emphasis, or without, right? Those, as you'll see here, are the 7 vertical lines, right? You'll count them. You should see there's 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yep, those are the 7 vertical lines, right? So that's 10. Those are the 10 Sefiros, right? How many letters of the Hebrew alphabet is that? 10. How many letters are there in the Hebrew alphabet total? 22. So the 22 are called the 22. The 22, the rest of them, pardon me, yes, the rest of them are called the 12 pshutot, which means the 12 simple letters. In other words, they're not the 3 mother letters, and they're also not letters that receive a dot, which are the remaining levels. And the Sefer Yetzirah calls them the Yud Beis Gvulei Alachson, which is a very mysterious phrase when you don't have the picture. Before someone's drawn the picture for you, you have no idea what it means, right? Which is the Yud Beis Gvulei Alachson means the 12 diagonal borders is really what it means. And here they are the 12 diagonal lines, which are drawn between all of the Sefiros are the Yud Beis Gvulei Alachson. Now, I'm only bringing the picture to try and illustrate to you this type of thing that you would see in Kabbalah. All of this is much more complicated, and the most dangerous thing is a picture. The most dangerous thing is a picture, because the picture makes you think that you have the whole picture, when in fact this picture is a massive, massive oversimplification in pretty much every possible way. However, let's go through these, okay? You have 3, here we're missing Das. Das would be below and between Chachma and Bina, where all those lines cross, right? Instead we have Keser, which is above them on this picture. But generally speaking, the principles are similar. Let's talk about the 3 kavim, right? There's 3 kavs. There's 3 lines, 3 rows of Sefiros. You have the right, you have the left, you have the middle, okay? Turn back to my notes I took about that. Generally speaking, you have the right side of the Sefiros are the side of revelation, giving, spreading, breadth, broadness. That's the right side, right, where you have Chochmah, Chesed, and Netzach. All of those Sefiros are connected because in each of their paradigms, there's three general paradigms or three general divisions within the 10 Sefiros, and each one of these is the head of its division, the first Sefira in its division. And they're all on the right side in this drawing because they all come from the side of right, which corresponds to kindness, openness, giving, right? The divine drawing forth, the drawing forth from God, right? The left side, the masculine energy, if you prefer, if that will help you remember it better, whatever that means, right? The left side, people are way too literal about that as well, by the way. It's a discussion for a different time. The left side, you have Bina. Bina is the you have the left side, which has Bina, Gvura, and Heid. This is the feminine energy, right? The receiving, sometimes known as the receiving energy. More precisely, this is the divine energy of withholding, the divine energy of judgment, of discipline, of severity, of order. It's also about preciousness. It's about defending and retaining the preciousness of things and the gathering of things all into one place rather than spreading them everywhere, right? So basically two opposite tendencies in the most general term. Then you have the middle line, which is known as the Mavriach HaTichon Min HaKatza LaKatza, which is a description from the Mishkan. In the Mishkan, each wall had three poles that ran through it, but most of the top pole and the bottom pole were divided into pieces. The middle pole was very long, no divisions. It went all the way from one end to the other, right? This is the middle pole of the Sefiros. The middle pole of the Sefiros reaches from the highest place here in Keser. That is correct whether you consider Keser a Sefira or not. It reaches all the way from Keser. Then you have Das, Tiferes, Yesod, and Malchus, which is the lowest place in the Sefiros. The middle row is the unity of, the balance of, the harmony of, we don't like the word balance, the harmony or integration of the right side and the left side in each paradigm, right? It is the combination of these two things. To give you a better sense of these, let's use the emotive qualities, right? For example, Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes, which are the three emotive qualities here. You have them right in the middle of the picture. That is the paradigm of the three Avos, the three forefathers of Abraham, who was Chesed, Isaac, who was Gvura, and Jacob, who was Tiferes, right? How did this manifest in their lives? The truth is we could do a whole hour just on that. It's very fascinating. But the way this manifested in their lives, most generally, is that Abraham was defined by kindness to all, his open tent, and also his wanderings. He was spread out. Abraham's tendency was to give of himself to the world. And in fact, Kabbalistically speaking, strictly speaking, chesed is not even really about whether there's anyone to give to, right? In other words, if there was no one else in the world, Abraham would be just as kind as he is, even when there are people to give to. Chesed is really an expression of a principle, right? The principle is the principle of being open, broad, spread out, given over. It's a natural tendency, right? We have to abstract these things from, the more you abstract them, the better, right? The less particular they are, the more general a principle they are, the closer they will be to the Sefira, although still usually very, very far. Gvura, the other side, which is Yitzchak, is the exact opposite. His whole life was spent in one place. He didn't want to meet people. He didn't go out of his way to find people, right? People came to him. That's a different story. And his whole life was spent digging wells, digging in one spot, right? Dig down, right? That's Gvura. Gvura is, the whole tendency is not to be spread to everyone, not to be open, not to be belonging to everyone, but to be belonging and contained even within yourself. And then you had Yaakov, who somehow is able to be both. Yaakov is for everyone, but also only for himself. And this, in the emotional traits, is called Rachamim, right? Rachamim, mercy, is the only one of these three things, by the way, which is not about a principle, but is about a person, right? And that's the distinguishing factor of the middle kav, of the middle row. In other words, a kind person is open and spreads themselves out, whether or not there's anyone to receive it. a severe, disciplined person, right, is all about the principle of self-containment, of the worth of something in itself, without it having to be spread out. Also has nothing to do with whether there's someone there to receive or not. Although, by the way, a Gvura person will give to someone if they deserve it, because that means the person is an extension of the already existing principle, rather than it having to go out of itself. Gvura is about not going out of yourself, right? Self-containment, in a sense. Tiferes, which is rachamim, which is mercy, is actually about the other person. Mercy is that it doesn't matter where the other person is, I acknowledge where they are, but I give to them anyway. Meaning, it's actually openness to the other person, and that's really why the middle row is the middle row, because the middle row is actually the one that extends from the self to the other. It's the one that goes from Keser, which is the very deepest self, right, all the way down to the other person. And you'll note that the middle row has no opposition. The side, right side and left side, are opposed to each other, balanced against each other. A dangerous word, balance again. But they're oppositional forces to some extent, at least in theory, right? Whereas the middle row has no opposition. The middle row really is the golden road between from the highest place to the lowest place, so to speak. All of these differences, when you would describe them as Sefiros in the process of creation, they all correspond to very lofty metaphysical things, right? Even though the way we understand them can only be through the personal and the way that a human being works, these principles all derive, like for example, chesed would be more on the side of Chachma would be more on the side of Bittul, whereas Bina would be more on the side of Yeshus, for example. And when you understand what nothingness and somethingness are at this very lofty level, right, you would understand that it has very little to do with wisdom and comprehension as we have them, for example. Okay, so that's the three rows. Let's now break down the divisions of the Sefiros, right? I said that they come in, they're different paradigms, right? So you divide them up according to, you have Seichel, which is the first three, which we're going to set Keser aside for our purposes, because this chapter of Tanya does not talk about Keser. So let's set aside Keser, which is the crown, which on this picture is the highest Sefira, right? We're going to talk about Chachma bin Adas, is one group. Then you have Chesed Gvur Tiferes, is another group. You have Netzach Jesed, which is a third group, and then you have Malchus, which is very special and a total outlier in many ways. It's the fourth Sefira in the third group of three, right? There's three groups of three, and it adds up to 10 because there's a fourth Sefira in the third group. Okay. Very, very briefly. In the soul, yeah. The first group is Seichel, Chachma Bina and Das. Chachma is maybe translated, it's often translated as wisdom. I'm going to be translating it as something like intuition, maybe, is a good translation. Bina is often translated as understanding, I would say analysis, analytical knowledge. Some people like to call these right brain, left brain. I don't know enough about right brain, left brain to know whether or not it's real or something that someone made up. The jury's probably still out, but whatever works for you. Maybe everything's not real and everything's made up. Who knows? Then you have Das. Das is very interesting because it's with the intellectual Sefiros, but Das is not really an intellectual understanding in the traditional sense as we would understand it. Das is really about connection, right? About what is within one's universe, within one's world, or outside of one's world. So, these three constitute Seichel. They constitute what's called the intellect. The intellect must be understood, and we'll have occasion to talk about this much more. The intellect must be understood in Chassidus not as thinking, just regular. There is no thinking, just regular. Maybe Machshava is thinking just regular. That's something else. The intellect must be understood as the soul's capacity for self-transformation and to make itself into an extension of something else. Again, Seichel has to be understood as the soul's capacity for self-transformation and its ability to make itself an extension of something else. right? In other words, when a person really understands something, really understands an idea, right, and they've become one with that idea through the process entailed by, it requires two sides, right, Chachma and Bina. Not all of you are polite enough not to ask, why, if the middle row is perfect, it doesn't have any opposition, do we even have the side ones, right? And the truth is that in the Sefiros, like I told you, there's no real logic and rationality. It can't really tell you how it works. But the Kabbalah does teach us that you'll see in this process, if you study it and study the Sefiros, you'll see that all the steps are necessary. You need the oppositional to give forth the middle position. Anyway, the combination of the integration. Okay. We will have to... No, not at all. We have to pause. Yeah, I'm sorry, we're way over. Let's... No, we're way over. Let's pause it here, and we will try and pick up in the same place next week. And we will next week, we'll try and continue where we left off, and then at the end of next week's class, we'll just start reading. We'll rearrange it. So we'll do that. We'll break it into halves. That's okay. I feel we covered a lot of important things today.